Juan Amigo. I have been pondering a certain point from your latest show with Cyprian that there are some academics/sociologists who seem rather dismissive of the concept of cults. I find this disgusting, but truly fascinating. I think the field of sociology is important and valid, but I also think it might be somewhat limited and possibly flawed. One simple analogy is this. At its worst, sociology is like studying schools of fish without sufficient focus on what an individual fish actually is. Another thing is there's arguably more than one renowned sociologist out there who seems to use a touch of coercive persuasion in their best-selling books. As you say, context is everything, and I admit to having a rather extreme personal aversion to being controlled, but might there be something in the field of applied sociology which makes it susceptible to things such as double binds? Like, if you want to apply sociological knowledge to changing society, certain tactics might seem necessary? Okay, Juan, thank you very much for this question. So sociology, critique of. I have been dealing with psychology, sociology, neuroscience, anthropology, ethnography. I mean, a few different fields over the years looking into and talking about high control groups or destructive cults. And sociology is a very important field for certain principles or certain framing of how we deal with groups of people at once. Because it's very, very interesting how sociology is a very necessary field. Psychology and sociology complement one another in the best of times. They can contradict one another in certain areas, I believe, but I haven't really found that to be true very much in terms of the actual raw fields. How people use or implement sociology or psychology can be, troublesome, problematic, difficult, or even just wrong-headed. And so some sociologists come off as kind of ridiculous sometimes in what they say. So do some psychologists, and so does anybody else. I don't think just because individual people, and I don't know if you're saying this, but I'm responding to your question as written. So I don't know if some sociologists get it so wrong or seem to say things that sound so ridiculous that it seems to invalidate the entire field, but I wouldn't really want to do that or go there. I think sociology is a very important science and something that needs a lot more research. Excuse me. So I think more, not less sociology is the answer as far as that goes. But you're making interesting points, and let me say how, at least as far as how I look at it, that where sociology it's about groups and looking at the phenomena or activity of numbers of people at a time. And it's very, very, very interesting how numbers of people will act sometimes incredibly differently than you would think they would when you look at individuals. And this comes down to the simple saying, I think, from the Men in Black movie that individuals are smart, people are stupid. Collectively, when we start acting together, the intelligence level of the group that we form tends to be kind of dumb compared to individuals in the group who can stop and, so from their point of view, sort of assess what the group is doing, what's going on. This is where we come home and bitch about what's going on at work that day. These guys, this boss, these guys don't have this organized right. They Well, from our point of view, we have good points and we're saying right things. But if you step back, you might see that your lone viewpoint in the group doesn't consider all these other situations or positions or propositions or problems. And so you think you've got it all nailed, but then when you get to the leadership role, you find out there's a lot more going on than you ever imagined happening. And so it's not necessarily that the group is that off the rails, but from your point of view, with your limited amount of knowledge, you thought it was, and then you find out the bigger picture problems and you go, oh, I didn't know. And that's more, I believe, that's the usual typical situation with human beings is that from their vantage point in a group, they have a limited number of data points, a limited number of things they can know about the group. And so from their perspective, they judge how smart or stupid the leadership is based on what they see. And of course they would. Why would it be any different? How would you be able to think any other way? You can't know what you don't know. My take as a critical thinker is that you can't know what you don't know, but you can always at least leave the possibility or leave the potential open that there are things you don't know. And so keep your judgments a little more reserved, a little bit more open to the possibility that you might be wrong or there might be more things to consider. And so don't go, all in on some criticism or some perspective without stopping and getting more information, more data from more people, more perspectives. I think that's the rational way to go about problem solving in a group. And generally speaking, that's how, when problems are solved, that's how it's done. Knowing how groups operate, knowing how the individual relates to the group, that's all sociology. Everything I'm sitting here talking about and describing in terms of the problems that we experience at work, the problems we experience in clubs and groups and things like that, that's sociology. So it is a very, very valuable field when you're talking about how that individual deals with the problems he encounters from the group, how he relates to other individuals in the group, how he responds and reacts or she deals with the problems and stresses and trauma that are provided by the group or put on them by the group. That's psychology. That's when you're dealing with the individual as an individual. But the individual as a group member and how the group operates and all of that. See, this is where these two fields mesh and why it's so important that sociologists and psychologists be talking to each other, especially when it comes to contentious group situations like cults. So this is why I'm always pushing for interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approaches to problems like Scientology. So in terms of sociologists using coercive persuasion in their books or something like that, you're going to run into every single problem with people that you run into in sociology. Sociologists aren't immune to any of those, to ego, in other words, right? To arrogance, to conceit, to the desire to have other people want to like their work. To all the things that individuals have, including our conceit and all that. Sociologists have all that too, So you might run into the odd sociologist who seems to be saying some pretty off the wall stuff or writing things that don't really. I don't know about that. Fair enough. This is why we have a big, broad field with a lot of peer review and a lot of work that gets done, and even then. Even despite all the scientific method and peer review process that we have, we still have fads enter into science and take over for a while. And, they sort of go this way and that way, and pendulums swing back and forth in the flavor of the month or flavor of the year for what's popular in the science for that time period. In other words, science as a group of people isn't any different from any other group of people. Some folks rise to the top and become popular, others don't. There's drama, there's the rise and fall of individuals and their influence. Same as any other group. And we see that in the sciences as much as we do anywhere else. Again, we know that because sociologists study it. You see? So the science is even capable of self-critique and self-correction to a degree by studying itself. Kind of fun, kind of interesting. So I don't know. So that's kind of how I see sociology, or can respond to this question about, let's critique sociology for a bit. Now, I hope I'm not missing anything here. As far as, dismissive of the concept of cults, this is most prominent from my experience in the field of religious studies, actually. And I talked about sociologists as well, because there are sociologists who get on this new religious movements train. And this is part of the cult wars. There have been for decades now, since the 70s, there have been academics in sociology, psychology, religious studies, and other disciplines who have taken very opposite positions on the goodness, badness, rightness, wrongness, utility or threat of religious groups that are based in religious spiritual ideas. And there's a whole lot of these religious scholars and some sociologists who look at these so-called new religious movements, which you and I would call a destructive cult. They call it a new religious movement. And they believe that any group has the right to believe what it wants and to practice what it wants, carry out those beliefs. As long as they're not killing people, what's the problem? And even if they are killing people, wow, that's interesting. Let's study that. I mean, from the academic point of view, it's legit that you have to have some objectivity. You can't just throw yourself emotionally and get emotionally invested in the subject matter that you're studying and expect to be able to produce objective results. And that's what science is for, and that's what it's about. So you're always going to want people to look at these things with a certain degree of objectivity, right? And not get all emotionally invested. That is impossible for somebody like me. Former cult members, right? We apostates, as they like to call us, are completely biased about the groups we were part of. That's a given. There's no way around that, and it's always going to be that way. I can't ever speak from a truly unbiased position about the subject of Scientology. I think the reasons for that are obvious. In the same way, though, some people enter into religious studies or into sociology with a preset mindset about new religious movements or, their opinion or their take on cults. And their idea is that that's not what these groups are, that's not what this is about. And their mission, their struggle, their fight is for religious freedom. They're all about First Amendment or freedom of belief, freedom to practice what you believe. And we need people who are going to be champions and guardians of that position, because religious freedom is something that a whole lot of authoritarians and a whole lot of very ignorant people want to take away from societies, from people. They don't want people to be able to practice whatever religion they want. They want to oppress people. They want to be authoritarians. And this class of sociologists and religious studies folks would be the ones pushing back against that. And to that degree, they're doing a good work. And we want that work being done. We want people who are on a mission to push for and defend religious freedom. What we don't want is an unnuanced look at that, right? We need to know that there are legit religious groups that are not harmful or destructive to their followers. People can go in, study, talk, have community, do their worship, go home, maybe throw a little money in the pot or not. It's up to them. Work with the group, make friends, have a community. Those are all net positives. We don't have a problem with those kind of groups. Obviously, we have a problem when, you enter into a group that says it's one of those groups, like Scientology, but then in the process of your membership, financially, emotionally, and maybe even physically, assaults and rapes you and leaves you, penniless and emotionally distraught and stressed out and traumatized, and then kicks you out, or, you escape and get away before more destruction could have happened, and then live to tell your tale, right? These groups like Scientology need to be fought against because they are not about religious freedom. They are about authoritarianism, and they are about control. the religious studies people and the sociologists who are all about religious freedom and freedom of belief, they don't look at these groups through that lens. They don't look at Scientology through a lens of a destructive cult. They look at it as another form of a new religious movement. And in fact, one of the newest ones, and one of the more interesting ones, because it's still a live, living religion that is growing right in front of your eyes. They want to study that. They want to know all about that. They want to look into that. And they might not necessarily know a whole lot. And I'm being generous here when I say they might not know about psychology, thought reform, right? Lifton, Hassan, Singer, Lalich. They don't pay attention to those scholars. They don't read about the Bite model. They don't read about Lifton and thought reform. So they don't really think about or look at these groups that way. And so they miss really great, big, obvious facts about these groups, like the fact that L. Ron Hubbard was a pathological liar and megalomaniac. And that might make him a religious leader in their eyes, but they should temper that religious leadership with the fact that he was intending and carried out purposefully a con. So is a religion that is a con actually a religion? Now, that's an interesting research question, and one that could be and should be researched very thoroughly by these people. But they don't do that because they refuse to consider that a religion can be a con. They don't even want to go there. They don't want to think about that. That concept or idea somehow smacks up against their idea of how the world works and how things should be and how these new religious movements should be granted all kinds of credibility and legitimacy. And that's where we have a parting of the ways, and that is where the cult wars have been being fought, is on these kind of ideas. So this has been going on for decades. It will continue to go on because we have very entrenched camps in academia now about these things. There are pro-Scientology academics and there are anti-Scientology academics. And I'm using this as a broad class. In other words, they're pro-cult and anti-cult. And it seems to me that the number who are anti-cult are less than the number who are pro-cult. And so we've had this struggle. And this has been a big problem for a long time for trying to move the ball forward in studying groups like Scientology with an eye towards delegitimizing them and classifying them as something not beneficial, not useful. They don't have utility. This has been very, very difficult, very difficult. So, especially because, of course, over the years, Scientology, the Moonies, the JWs, I don't know about the JWs actually, but certainly the Moonies and Scientology and many other groups have actually paid academics to write features and essays and articles and journal entries that are pro-cult. Right? That, hey, the Moonies are great. Moonies are all right. I don't see any evidence of thought reform here. I lived amongst the Scientologists for a while, and I didn't see any problems, so there is no problem. Well, I think that statement in itself kind of shows pretty clearly what the problem is, right? Because when an academic gets wined and dined by Scientology, they are not being shown the RPF. They are not being shown the whole. They are not being shown, the rigorous, torturous activities that go on there. Or they're given some, airy-fairy explanation for something like the RPF, and they buy it because they have a pro-cult bias. So that's where we run into trouble with the sociologists and the religious studies folks in the field of studying cults. And I don't know, maybe this is more than what you were asking for in your question, but this is my address to this whole issue. I've written a piece for the Underground Bunker that should be published soon there about this exact thing, and you'll be seeing some more critiques from me about academia in the coming weeks from this on the Underground Bunker blog from this whole idea that I'm talking about right now. So this has been kind of on my mind lately. So that's maybe one of the reasons I took this question up also. Anyway, so there you go. I hope that this was illuminating in some fashion as to what's going on behind the scenes in the world of academia with cults. So there you go.